Okay, so I chose for my book Teaching History for the Common Good. And this book is basically about the purpose of teaching history and how that connects to students' current grasp on historical thinking and kind of the historical culture that they've been raised in. So the authors talk about how there's been this long-standing disagreement on what should be taught in our schools and how it should be taught. Like, should we focus on factual information or just interpretation of events, or should we just give like this nice unified historical narrative, or do we want to view history from like a critical standpoint, talking about mistakes and things like that? Anyways, so Barton and Levstick go through and they talk about these different debates through like a really systematic analysis of how students think and how that affects how we should present this historical information to them. Barton and Levstick start out by asking the question why we should even teach history. They talk about how in some nations history is taught simply because it's an academic topic and it's something needed to get good test scores and to just have a general education. They talk about how this isn't a good enough explanation for them though, and that history should have a motivation, a why behind it, to help us kind of fit it into our education better and give more meaning to it. So their main answer to this question is that history should be taught to help prepare students to participate in a democracy and to continue like active citizenship in our communities. They So ultimately, at the end of the first chapter, the purpose of teaching history, they say ultimately students must go forward in the heat and jostle of the crowd, as Jane Addams put it, and history should help them identify with the common lot, which is the essential idea of democracy. So basically, our purpose in teaching history is to help students go out into the world, the heat and jostle, and identify with others and work with others to continue our democracy. So then the first about half of the book, they talk about four main approaches to teaching history. They are identification, analysis, moral response, and exhibition. So each of these is kind of a different method to present historical information to students. So we can simply identify dates and events. We can analyze those events and figure out what happened in each and why. We can talk about moral responses to different events and try and talk more about the ethical implications of different events. Or exhibition is kind of how history influences our current day, how it exhibits itself currently. Then the second half of the book, they outline 6 tools for teaching history, and those are narrative structure, stories of individual achievement and motivation, national narratives, inquiry, empathy as perspective taking, and empathy as caring. So each of these is just kind of different um, formats for presenting information, or different sources to bring in to help keep students engaged. And they talk about the benefits and weaknesses of each of those. And then as their conclusion, they kind of wrap up with a chapter written to teachers, and they talk about the importance of teacher education and content knowledge. And then very last is their conclusion. They talk about how currently the motivation for teaching history is simply like our methods of teaching history is based on coverage of content and then control of our classrooms. So we basically pass on this same method of teaching from teacher to teacher and generation to generation that maybe is not super effective, but we do it because we want to cover content and then we want to keep our classrooms controlled. And so they talk about how it's maybe not the most effective way, but we do it because it covers both of these goals and we appear to be more in line with our peers and what is expected and what has traditionally been done in classrooms, which is not necessarily the best way to teach history. Okay, so really quick, I want to talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of the book. First, my first impression, the book is super scholarly, which it's great that it's professionally written. It's not really based on opinion, or it doesn't really contain any personal narrative, so there's not really any emotion in it. It's all factually based on research and then conclusions that have been drawn from this research, which makes it very like trustworthy kind of and very factual. Second, it provides tons and tons of research. Um, they are constantly citing like inquiries they've done in classrooms with different ages of students, and so there's lots of research on student attitudes and exactly how different methods influence these different attitudes. Third, it's super well organized. There's the four main approaches that they list, and then they go into the six main tools. And then at the end of each chapter, there's a conclusion, so you kind of can reread everything you just read. Me personally, it really helped me understand different approaches to history. I used to just think that, you just told stories and presented history in one way, but they really helped me understand all these different lenses that you can view history through and different benefits and consequences to each of these lenses. Weaknesses. My first thought is incredibly dense. I don't think I ever would have gotten through this book if it hadn't been an assignment for class. It's just really technical language. The authors are very removed kind of from the reader, and so there's just a lot of formal language that's really difficult to get through. I also didn't love um, the end of the book. I was kind of expecting more of a moral stance to be taken by the authors and kind of for them to give this conclusion at the end of what we were supposed to do. And I felt like they didn't really give that. They just kind of just left us up in the air as to what we should change and what we should do moving forward as history teachers. So the book, though, does a great job at contributing to our understanding, my understanding especially, of why history is important. Since I started this major, I've really been trying to find an answer for myself. And this, as I went through the book, I was underlining things and kind of trying to formulate my own opinion of why history is important. And I thought the book did a really good job of contributing this understanding of a participatory democracy and how history is super important to that and how we can teach students to be better citizens in their communities. Things that really stood out to me. The first is one of the 6 tools that they gave for presenting historical information was using narratives to kind of generate empathy or teaching students to care. The authors talk about how a lot of times history is presented in a way where we're supposed to be removed and we're supposed to teach without emotion or without bias. And they state that we cannot interest students in the study of history if we reject their cares and concerns or if we dismiss their feeling and emotions. So basically, an application to pull from this is that it's all right to kind of enlist or evoke emotions and an emotional attachment with the past and with these narratives because it helps students to connect with these stories, to remember them, and to apply them to their emotions and things that they've experienced in their lives. I just thought that was a good application to take into a teaching setting as history teachers. The second thing I wanted to talk about is at the very, very end of the book, the authors kind of write directly to teachers, and they're talking about pedagogical knowledge and how that factors into our actual teaching. And they state that regardless of how much education we get or how much content knowledge we actually have, that doesn't always characterize how good our classrooms are going to be run or how effectively we are going to teach. They say there simply does not seem to be any evidence that teacher knowledge is a variable that predicts classroom practice. I kind of like this just because I feel like as a social science major, I'm spread very thinly over a bunch of different subjects, and I feel like I don't have the greatest content knowledge about history. But this statement, this chapter that they talked about how that is not necessarily king, that we can still be effective teachers simply by our classroom practices and implementing different classroom strategies that we've been taught so far in our college education. This made me reflect back to class and using different methods of teaching. They even talk about how they use an example of two teachers and how one teacher was super involved with like group discussions and inquiry based learning, and then another teacher had the exact same credentials, but he was used simply direct instruction in that he was really good at it though. And so these two teachers were both incredibly effective and used completely different styles, but the important thing is that we're practicing and improving our style of teaching and learning to be most effective with what we are doing. Last but not least, a gift idea based on something from this book would be to kind of go along with the generating empathy thing that I talked about earlier. You could have a gift at the beginning of class where students write down these three sentences: I care about, I care that, and I care for. So each of these sentences is kind of addressing a different thing. I care about is talking more about ideas and interests, things like that. I care that is talking about events. I care that the election is happening today. And then the third one I care for is talking about people. I care for my grandmother. I care for my father. Anyways, this is just kind of a gift to get students thinking about things that they're connected to, things that they care about, kind of their own heritage and their personal narrative. And then you can use that to segue into a historical narrative and things that we should care about historically.